Hey everybody, how you doing? This is your change architect, Patrick Brown. Thank you for connecting with me today on the Change Matters podcast. It's been a while. I just wanted to come on and connect with you. So if you're out there, please go ahead and please subscribe to my YouTube channel, as well as share with others, tag your friends. Let's collect. Let me know that you're here. It's good to see everyone this evening. Hello, hello, hello. Glad that you all are doing well this evening. I know that we're finishing up our Black History Month. Of course, we live all year, but nonetheless, I wanted to make sure that we came on today and had a little conversation about some books. That's right, some content. And I wanted to come on and talk a little bit about a few books that I think are must reads if you're going to study Black history, Black culture, in particular ideals that come out of the Renaissance of Black people. And so I wanted to have that discussion because of the greatness of what we're celebrating this month. And I wanted to just highlight a few books I think are critical that you can perhaps put in your collection or maybe go find out what they're about. So if you're out there, please let me know that you're on. Share with your friends, invite others to the conversation to review this evening. I'd love to hear your comments about what we're discussing. And also make sure that you place the notification on if you're on my YouTube channel, and make sure that you subscribe, because we're going to have some future conversation once I launch my podcast. But I just wanted to come in for a little conversation this evening with you out there. So it's good to see everyone. Glad that you're on. Hey, Carmela, how you doing? Hope, good to have you on. Ravella, good to see you. Dr. Sam Hinton, how you doing, my brother, down there in Carolina? Bulldogs raise up. What's up, man? How you doing? Doing good things. I know in higher education, he is a scholar, everyone. Good to have you on. Everyone else that's out there, please make sure that you subscribe, and we're going to have some conversation. And that's one thing about change, is that if you're going to change the direction of a thing, you want to change the conversation, but you also want to change who joins that conversation. And so I think it's important that we have dialogue. And so that's what this is about. See you in a moment. Hello again. Thanks so much. This is your change architect, Patrick Brown. Hey, Audrey, how are you doing? I hope all is well. Good to have you on. I wanted to come on today, folks, to really review some books, some readings. You know, there's going to be reading across America this coming Wednesday. And I know that the emphasis mainly is for children, but I think it's all important. We know that leaders are readers and readers are leaders. But I think it's also important that we begin to look at ideas and have discussion of those ideas and ideals. And so I have several books here as a bibliophile. So I wanted to go through a few books I think that perhaps if you have not read, or maybe you have read them, it would be good to go back and take some notes and engage in some critical and creative thinking while you're there. So I'd like you, if you're on today, I want you to please post, hey, Erica, how are you? Good to have you on. Thanks for coming. Go ahead, if you will. And in the chat, in the comments, I want you to place down some of your favorite books by Black authors or about Black people by other cultures. Any particular book that evokes a particular perspective. And I'm not going to be reading any fiction this evening or poetry or spoken word, but I want to go through different books. I think that if you're going to have a rich discussion, it's always good to have a discussion that has some tension. We're not going to develop any muscle if we don't have any tension. So it's important that we have conversations and read ideas that would cause us to think through why we think the way that we think. So I want to start off with a few things I think that's important for my collection. I have several books, and I wanted to go through them. I've read each and every one of them. So I'm going to start off with one of my favorite thinkers who, matter of fact, passed recently, I think in October of last year, and that is Bell Hooks. Bell's Hook book, Sisters of the Yam. This particular book, she writes on Black women and self-recovery. And I remember this book, read this many years ago. I think it might have been in grad school because this book was published in 93. And Sisters of the Yam, Black women and self-recovery, this particular book addresses the inner well-being of Black women. How Black women their development is shaped by the different institutionalized structures that are out there, perhaps. She takes on issues such as addiction or truth-telling and work and grieving, spirituality, reconciliation, forgiveness. These are different themes that are in this particular book, Sisters of the Yam. Now, Dr. Bell Hooks has so many different other writings that I have here. This is the one I want to highlight this evening. There's another book called We Real Cool, Black Men and Black Masculinity. This particular book is interesting. It's an untraditional take on Black men and Black masculinity. And so you read this, you just better be ready for I would say, a different interpretation of patriarchy, even conservative religious traditions and other types of notions that are considered to be acceptable by men. The interesting book, nonetheless. The Will to Change, that's another one of her books, which is Men, Masculinity, and Love. Several other books. I think there's one, Breaking Bread, which was a conversation that she had with Cornel West many years ago. So Sisters of the Yam, and then of course one of her resounding books is Ain't I a Woman? Black Women and Feminism. And so I want to emphasize Sisters of the Yam. Good evening, Keisha. How are you? Deidre, how are you? Good to have you on, everyone. So I want to talk about these books because these particular books are for Black people about Black subjects, and we all need to have these types of discussions. So I'm going to read a little bit from Sisters of the Yam. And if you're out there, I want you to put in the chat some of the things that you've read, authors that you've read, books that you've read, historically even, or contemporary, that I think that'll help evoke a different perspective, an emotion, or an ideal or a concept concerning Black folk. Something she says here in one of the chapters on Dreaming Ourselves Dark and Deep says, clearly, if Black women want to be about the business of collective self-healing, we have to be about the business of inventing all manner of images and representations that show us the way we want to be and are. Say that again. Clearly, if Black women want to be about the business of collective self-healing, Bell Hook writes, we have to be about the business of inventing all manner of images and representations that show us the way we want to be and are. I think that's powerful. We need to control our own image. It's important that we control our own representation. And I think it's important that we recognize that many times what we portray and what we represent really is about control and commodification. I began to think about this when I read this many years ago, and whatever you can control, you can commodify it. And once you make something a commodity, you can determine its value. She is writing very deeply that as Black women, Black women must be about the business of collective self-healing, but also inventing all manner of images and representations that really reveal who we are and what Black women want to be. And so I find that a very powerful thing concerning life-affirming images of Black womenness. And I'm interested in finding out from the sisters out there that what kind of images perhaps did you grow up with? What kind of manner of images and representations that you're creating around you, or perhaps that impacted you, whether positively or negatively, concerning who you are as a Black woman. And this particular book really dives into that. So if you're out there, please connect with me. I'm not seeing too many comments. I'd like to hear from you, what your thoughts are, because it does get into the politics of skin color, the politics of hair, the politics of beauty and aestheticism. And so I really enjoy this particular book because of the nature of that conversation. So again, if you want to have a book that really dives into the consciousness and the inner well-being of Black women in terms of how their development, Black women's development, has been shaped by even some of the daily assault that Black women have dealt with, I think this helps with that because it can help heal, it can help create an atmosphere of empowerment, but also it can spark conversations of ownership and accountability of where Black women are. And so that's Sisters of the Yam. This was published in 1993. Very good book. Any thoughts on that? If you're out there, let me know what your thoughts are. I'd love to hear from you and get your thoughts. And again, we're on the Change Matters podcast. I'm Change Architect Patrick Brown. And please go ahead and share this and let's connect. Let's have some dialogue. And if you're out there and you want to come on and have a conversation with me, let me know. And I definitely will drop you the link and we can dialogue concerning some of this content and the books that I'm reviewing this evening and get your perspectives perhaps on different books that you may have read. All right. So I'm so glad to have you all looking at this podcast today and engaging. All right. So let's go to another book. Let's see what I have here. One of my other favorite authors. I got this book. Oh gosh. This is one of the original books, as you can see. It's $1.45. So you know that this was like published in the 60s. This book by Frantz Fanon, who was a psychiatrist, a Black psychiatrist from France. His book, The Wretched of the Earth, the handbook for the Black Revolution that is changing the shape of the world. Frantz Fanon. All right. I really, really, really like this book. Ravella is saying perceptions, the strong Black woman syndrome, always be strong, not to show weakness. You know, isn't it interesting that we have images of that being strong means that you have to be that you have to have it all in order. You know, I think that vulnerability is what's important, right? It's not weak to be vulnerable, but if we have a perception that we always have to be strong, then what ends up happening is we begin to not be vulnerable about the fact that I really don't like to have to show that I constantly have to be strong. What do you think about that, sisters? I think that's important that we have that discussion. And Ravella, thank you for bringing that up about perceptions. Sisters of the Yam does deal with that. So I appreciate you sharing that. The Wretched of the Earth, this particular book was written in anger. And sometimes it's important to be able to have conversations out of anger, because those types of revelations that come out of anger really help you understand where you are. And I think it's important that we ask ourselves, well, why am I angry? And the importance of, once we find out why, then what happens is there's something that heals inside of us when we answer that question. What do you think about that? This particular book, I tell you, as a distinguished psychiatrist that was speaking for the revolution and for independence for Algeria in particular, and he died, I think might have been 36 or 37 years old. But Frantz Fanon has written Black Skin and White Masks, toward the African Revolution. I would encourage you, if you haven't read any of these books, this is one that you need to read. The Wretched of the Earth. And I want to share briefly from one of the preface of this book, where Frantz Fanon talks about this. Make no mistake about it, he writes, by this mad fury, by this bitterness and spleen, by their ever-present desire to kill us, by the permanent tensing of powerful muscles which are afraid to relax, they have become men. Men because of the settler. Men who want to make beasts of burdens of them because of him and against him. Wow. Hatred, blind hatred, which is as yet an abstraction, is their only wealth. The master calls it forth because he seeks to reduce them to animals, but he fails to break it down because his interests stop him halfway. Oh, that's just a small nugget of this book. And I think there are times when we read from history. That's why it's important that you learn to tell your own story, because if you don't tell your story, somebody else will write it for you. If you don't document it, it didn't happen. So it's important that even if it's anger, whatever it might be, documentation helps you express the depths of your humanity. And don't be afraid of it when you're writing. Don't be afraid of it when you're telling your story. Don't be afraid of it when you're sharing your journey. These types of books like this, The Wretched of the Earth, helps us understand many times if there's not a revolution from the top down, or a revelation from the top down in terms of leadership, then there'll be a revolution from the bottom up. And so this particular book dives into that subject matter of how a certain groups of people have been treated as the wretched of the earth. I read this book, I don't know how many times. His first book was actually Black Skin and White Masks. And this particular book, I think, is a brilliant examination of the role of violence in affecting historical change. And I know some may say, well, goodness, Why would you want it? We should be nonviolent. Wow, he talks about the importance that violence at that particular time was an examination of the role of it in effecting social transformation. And so it ended up becoming one of those veritable books or handbooks, if I could say, concerning revolutionary practice and how to reorganize society. All right. So I think this is something that is worth examining. I think it's worth looking at in light of the different oppressive systems that still exist in this world, that many times if there's not a revelation from leaders, then there'll be a revolution from the citizens. The Wretched of the Earth covers that with incredible anger that is focused and targeted and interpreted. So there you go. Wretched of the Earth, folks. I think it's important that these are discussions that need to be had. So I'm going to give you a couple of other books. And if you're out there watching, let me know that you're there. And if there are a few types of books that you've read, please go ahead and put the author and information in there, and we can have a discussion about it. Perhaps maybe I've read it, and we can share, swap ideas, and begin to share that with each other. I think that's important. So good to have everyone on this evening. And again, thank you for connecting with me on the Change Matters podcast. I like to have these kinds of conversations so that we can continue to expand our thoughts concerning how we are thinking because of the books that we read. So far, I have covered Sisters of the Yam by Bell Hooks. The next book is The Wretched of the Earth by Frantz Fanon. All right, let's keep going. I want to also share something about this book, Christopher Columbus and the African Holocaust, Slavery and the Rise of European Capitalism by John Henrik Clarke, the late, great Kemetic African scholar. And I tell you, I got this book many years ago as well. I remember sitting on his lectures in the mid-90s when I was working on my my graduate degree. At the time, I was studying African American and Africana Studies, North Carolina A&T State University, also Columbia University. And I remember sitting in lectures and hearing this man just sit there and began to really share a different, unique perspective on African liberation. And this particular book, I want to share something from his book from chapter 5, where he talks about the slave trade, how and why it started. Because many times you'll have people that'll say, hey, it was like Africans went to Europe and said, hey, come enslave us. That's not what happened. All right. So we have to recognize that in Africa at that particular time, that there was something called honor for the land that Africans embraced. So it wasn't about land being bought or sold. And one of the things that he shares in his book is that the land belonged to everyone. The land belonged to everyone. Think about that. So he goes into the basis for the European Industrial Revolution, or even industrial complex for that matter, that had already been established. And in doing so, the main problem with the African at that time and dealing with the European at that time was that the African had a tragic naivete. In that naivete was not knowing how to extensively deal with European people at that time. And so because the African came out of a more kind, more nature, there was enough in the land fed them everything, the basic needs that they needed to have a good life, to have the quality of what they had. It wasn't about land being bought and sold. It was concerning that the land belonged. And here comes a European coming from a society where nature was rather stingy, competition, conquering, exploitation. And so they inquired. There was a competitive nature that was introduced into African society that was not necessarily there as it relates to the land. This book covers that. Isn't that interesting? So this particular book I would recommend so that you can have a unique perspective on Christopher Columbus, but also the rise of the slavery and the rise of European capitalism, where it all started. He goes into forced migrations, talks about the broader dimensions of that particular transformational crisis that was transgenerational, and goes through some retrospect concerning the sorrow in the new land. So if you have not read any of John Henrik Clarke's work, you can YouTube him. There's incredible lectures. Now, you may not like it, you may not agree with it, and you got to understand, critical race theory is a theory. It's not about anything except for the fact that it's important to look at history from various lenses so that you can learn and absorb from different perspectives. That's not what this is, but I just thought I'd mention that for those that are listening. So again, Christopher Columbus and the African Holocaust, he talks about this extensively and the importance of remembering these. And we remember so that we can learn from it. We remember so it'll never happen again. We remember because we honor those that made it and those that did not. So again, Christopher Columbus and the African Holocaust. Incredible book. Going through all my old books, right? So let's see what else I got here. And again, I think it's important that we read, that we study, that we have critical perspectives. Now, this book I read at grad school as well. No, I read this in undergrad, I think. And The Community of Self by Dr. Naeem Akbar. And this book, if you are a mental health practitioner, you need to get this. It just needs to be fundamental, especially if you're African American. You're Black and you are a mental health practitioner, professional, psychologist, psychiatrist, counselor, pastor, and you are concerned about the mental health of Black people. You need to have The Community of Self in your library. All right. Let me read something from this particular book, because this one is revised, but it's a unique psychological approach to the functioning of African American minds. He writes in this book, and listen to this. He says, there is a real twofold advantage that we have in this modern society. On the one hand, we have a choice to either grow or not grow. No one requires us to develop ourselves, and there is a considerable company, the majority of the population, that chooses not to grow. If you make the choice not to grow, then you are free to be a slave to the many influences that are anxiously, waiting to take over your life. The second choice is whether you want to exercise control over your life or not. If you decide to take growth, then you will have to either place yourself in the proper ground for growth or become a parasite and feed on someone else's growth. Once you make the choice to grow, then you will have to exercise some control over the influences in your life. Wow. Then he goes on to say this. Therefore, you must determine the volume of some of the popularity music that's too loud, messages that are too destructive. You must turn it off. You must decide that the images portrayed in the visual media are too distracting, and you eliminate them from your experience. I mean, I'm going on. But again, The Community of Self, one of the most profound books. Just want to share some things. I think that if you're African American, you want to think African American, you want to talk African American, you want to talk about history, you want to review, you want to have some critical thinking and critical dialogue concerning consciousness of Black folk in America, here you go. All right, Community of Self. Questions, comments? Y'all quiet out there. Let me know that you're there. All right, this is my podcast. Just want to engage you and connect with you. Here's another one. Dr. Howard Thurman, The Luminous Darkness. The Luminous Darkness. Howard Thurman. This particular writing is a commentary on what segregation did to the human soul at that time. It was published in the 60s, and really it was his approach of how do we heal the wounds as they were watching the fight for apartheid in South America at that particular time. And so Thurman begins to really dive into the evils of segregation, but also tries to bring hope into bringing men and women together. And I wanted to share something from this book, because if you haven't read Howard Thurman, especially if you're a preacher and you're in ministry, you're really missing out. Towering intellectual. And again, as you're reading older books, you got to remember that certain terms that are used, because that's where that was the social construct in language at the time. And so The Luminous Darkness, Howard Thurman, this book, profound. I've read it I don't know how many times, just to make sure that I stay aware of his history and the inferences that come as a result of the transfer of knowledge from one generation to the next. Here he writes, he says, I have spoken of what the overall change in climate, world climate in general, and the American climate in particular contributes to the loss of fear. But there is something more. One may lose fear also by a sense of being a part of a company of people who share the same concerns and are conscious of participating in the same collective destiny. This is an additional form that the feeling of community inspires. A strange and wonderful courage often comes into a man's life when he shares a commitment to something that is more important than whether he himself lives or dies. It is the discovery of the dynamic character of life itself. Wow. Wow. I mean, just consider these words from The Luminous Darkness. I'm so grateful for these types of, imagery. How is darkness luminous? It's a contradiction at best. And so, as a mystic thinker, as a philosopher and a theologian, Dr. Thurman, just incredible thinker. And I think that this commentary that he writes, dealing with the collective consciousness, the stream of consciousness, and also the wounds as a result of how segregation impacted the human soul. The Luminous Darkness. If you have not read it, especially if you're in ministry, and you haven't read Howard Thurman, you need to stop what you're doing and go back and read Dr. Howard Thurman. All right, Luminous Darkness, just incredible. I have several of his books here. I don't want to bring all of those up, but one of my favorites among many of the others, especially the Meditations of the Heart, Jesus and the Disinherited. That particular book, Disciplines of the Spirit. So I want to encourage you to get that, especially if you're into the area of helping build and strengthen people in their hope and in their faith. This is a good book. So we reviewed 5 books so far that I think are important. I'm going to go over them one more time. All right, we started out with Sisters of the Yam by Bell Hooks. Then we moved into The Wretched of the Earth by Frantz Fanon. Then we also have Christopher Columbus and the African Holocaust, Professor John Henry Clarke. The Wretched of the Earth, I think I've covered that. The Community of Self, Dr. Naeem Akbar, towering psychologist. All right. What else I want to share here? I want to go to 2 old books. I'll get those last. Let me share something else with you by Thomas Sowell. All right. And this book, Civil Rights, Radical Reality, was written in 1984. All right. An economist, professor, thought leader, conservative thinker. In this particular book, he begins to review, basically critique the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and that particular legislative landmark that really defined, it was a judicial breakthrough for that particular age. He begins to go through what's the actual promise and premise of those legislative and judicial events, and have they really been fulfilled? How much has been perverted, perhaps, or how well has that social vision behind the civil rights movement been understood or even questioned, for that matter? And so he addresses that book. Was it rhetoric or is it reality? I think it's worth the discussion. I think it's worth that we look at effect versus intentions, or we look at both and see what has taken place as a result of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, especially because of its inclusive nature and how it was written. And as a result of that, did it really do what it needed to do Were there assumptions, and was it really history? I mean, there's so much that's in there, and so I think this type of book is worth reviewing, especially if you're one that has particular ideals that you just disagree with how policy is written, and legislative achievements that are not beyond critique. Everything is open to critique and conversation, and so this particular book does that. Any of the things that he writes, I think, is important to analyze and look at. Whether you agree with these particular authors or not, I think it's important that you're exposed to that type of dialogue. All right. Another one I think is a little bit more contemporary. If you're out there, please let me know what are some thoughts that you have concerning some of the writings that I'm reading this evening, the ideas that I'm portraying. This book. Wait, I'll wait on that one. Here's another one. These are two more recent. This one by Dr. Reggie L. Williams, which is Bonhoeffer's Black Jesus, Harlem Renaissance Theology and an Ethic of Resistance. Now, if you know anything about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who publicly confronted Nazism and anti-Semitic racism in Hitler's Germany. So what Bonhoeffer does in his writing is he begins to really critique the mixture of theology with Christian movements in Germany that turns Jesus into an ideal. Wow. So in other words, that's how certain things begin to arise in that particular time of history. And so as a result of that, Bonhoeffer provided Christian responses to those atrocities that took place at the time. And so Bonhoeffer offers a Christology that this particular author uses this as looking at Harlem's Black Jesus, per se. In other words, in the pews of different Black churches, Baptist church traditions, that was absorbed in the Harlem Renaissance, and why it was absorbed in the Harlem Renaissance at that time, when there was a resurgence of Black art, Black literature, Black music, Black dance, Black theology, Black poetry, Black essays, Black essayists and novelists at the time. And so this particular book examines that there's a Christianity that includes Jesus, who stands with those that have gone through oppression, rather than an image that Jesus joins the oppressors. And so this, wow. And no, this is not saying that, you as a people are oppressed or these group of people are the oppressed. It's history, folks. Anytime you can't go and eat in a restaurant because of the color of your skin, that's an oppressive society. It is what it is, right? And that's the nature of what's happened in our particular nation. And so I think it's worth the examination, because people transfer their ideas if they're not learned. If they're not learned, then they're going to transfer their ideas, and people are going to learn isms and schisms as a result of ignorance, of not knowing. And people live at the mercy of not knowing. And so, wow, this is a great reading. I really enjoyed reading this one because it helped me understand the importance of how the gospel is about freedom. And the foundation of Luke chapter 4 talks about the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. And Jesus begins to prophesy from Isaiah, talking about opening of sight of the blind and recovery of sight, and set at liberty those that are bruised, and preach the acceptable year of the Lord. So I think that this is important, that we have various approaches to how we're looking at literature, how we look at life. And one thing about the study of literature, and thank you for sharing that, Carmela, concerning that, because the study of literature is about the study of life, the study of ideologies, the study of communication, and how those ideas are conveyed, and how we have discourse and discussion, and even perhaps didactics. What type of teaching comes out of that dialogue that's inherent in when we share our stories. And that's why documentation and writing and thinking, creative and critical thinking, are so important, because somebody has to tell the story. And if the stories are not told, they get lost. And with that comes the truth. With that loss is also the truth. So thank you for sharing that, Camilla. Camilla sharing. I like that you're presenting and discussing diversification of Black literature. Absolutely. That's important that we do that. So again, Bonhoeffer's Black Jesus, Harlem Renaissance Theology, and an Ethic of Resistance. I hope that you're not offended by the title. If you don't like those types of terms, I didn't create the word black, white, or other. The construct of race existed before I came on the earth. So it is what it is. So if you're out there, please share with me, what are your thoughts? Hobie said it's a powerful book. Which book were you referring to? I think you were probably talking about the one, The Wretched of the Earth. I'm not sure which one, but I wanted to share a few of these books that are in my personal library that I think that I would encourage you to read. Thoughts so far, folks? All right. Let's go on to a few more. Now, this one was written by Catherine Gerbner. And Catherine Gerbner is a professor that teaches history at the University of Minnesota. This book is called Christian Slavery, Conversion and Race in the Protestant Atlantic World. Now, this book, I read this one as well. And one thing I appreciate about this book is, again, we're talking about Black history, Black books that are written either for Black people or by Black people or about them. So I wanted us to be able to address this. And this one deals with the conversion and race in the Protestant Atlantic world. It's a fairly new book. It's only about 3 or 4 years old. But I think the whole polysemic concept of Christian slavery is incredible, because the descriptions of slavery in the text, how particular perspectives were used, missionaries that emphasize the beneficial aspects of slave conversion, arguing what would happen if they were converted and how religion can be used to make people more docile, and Christian slavery. This book, awesome. So I would encourage us to take a look at this. I want to read a few from this, if that's all right. If you're interested, let me know what your thoughts are on the books that I'm reading from. So this book deals with slavery in early Christianity. So watch this. It says the early church not only accepted slavery, but also preached the enslavement could be spiritually advantageous. Wow. Believers describe themselves as slaves of Christ. And while masters were urged to treat their slaves humanely, there was no ban on enslaving other Christians. The Roman Church itself owned numerous Christian slaves, particularly on monastery lands, and early Christian theologians consistently reconciled slavery and Christianity. Now, this is prior to, because there's been slavery on every continent in the world. Because when human beings don't know that they're the image and likeness of God, they run amok and try to dominate and control other people. Well, this author continues, says St. Augustine used slavery as a metaphor for sin and described true spiritual freedom as spiritual rather than material. For Augustine, slavery was both a consequence of and a remedy for sin, and similar connections between sin and slavery can be found in the writings of St. Ambrose, Ambrosiaster, St. Isidore of Seville, and Philo, the works of Philo of Alexandria. They say this: freeing one's slaves was considered a pious act, but it was neither expected nor common. Wow. Again, Christian Slavery by Catherine Gerbner. I thought this was a great review of history and the different expansionism, Iberian expansionism, that led to African slavery from that end, and then also slavery and Catholicism in Latin America. So all those areas connects it to the church in every sense of the word. And so I think it's important that we take a look at these types of books. And the thing about this book is that this book shows how the contentions between slave owners, enslaved people, and missionaries transformed the practice of Protestantism and the language of race in the early modern Atlantic world. How the words of race emerged that came out of the Christian tradition. It sure did. That's why it's important that we have these discussions. No, it's not. I'm a Christian. I can't. Well, look, read history, folks. It took place, and we got to look at it. And so I think it's important that we look at that. Thoughts, perspectives. All right. Christian slavery, conversion and race in the Protestant Atlantic world. Very another good book by Catherine Gerbner. You're welcome. You're welcome. You're welcome. Thank you so much, everyone, for commenting. And please share, because these are things that we need to be able to have discussions about. I just wanted to come on, since we're wrapping up Black History Month tomorrow. Come on and do a book review and just look at certain books I think is important for you to read, especially for those of you that are in ministry and thought leaders. Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that, Kimberly. You're absolutely right. True freedom requires you to look at the truth no matter how uncomfortable. We may not want to look at it, but it is freedom when we begin to expose ourselves to the facts. And again, I always like to say, we don't absorb what we observe. We learn from what we observe. We are transformed by what we observe when we begin to understand how to begin to appropriate that for our lives, and we can experience mental freedom and transformation. Something else I want to share too that I think is powerful. Maybe I'll read this a little bit deeper, but this book is called Confederate Currency, The Color of Money. Confederate Currency, The Color of Money. Images of slavery in Confederate and Southern states currency. See this? This is a picture of what was on the Confederacy money. This whole book basically draws from the economics of slavery. Well, it wasn't racist. Look, if money was involved, it's racist. If control was involved with groups of people, it was racist. Just like Wakanda had vibranium, America had slaves. You see? They became a large nation, the fictional Wakanda. They had vibranium and were able to build their country. Same thing with America. America had slaves. And as a result of that, they became powerful. Well, look at this. I'm going to show you a few things I think is important. Look at these pictures. This particular picture, these are pictures that were on the dollars, on the cash. They were on the cash of the Confederate money. Look at that. The happy slave on the cotton plantation on the money. Here's some of the images here. Look at the 50 cents there. Mississippi. See the picture there? That's the Mississippi dollar. 50 cents, and has the slave out there. The images. The Central Bank of Alabama. Wow. Because cotton was king. The state of South Carolina. This particular image of a slave cooking dinner. That particular image was on the $5 bill of the Confederacy. Folks, these are things that we got to be able to document. I know many of you probably have never seen this before, but I have to. Being from Charleston, South Carolina, being from down south, these are discussions that I'm so glad I was exposed to. But I wanted to share this with you because I think it's important that we look at images like this. Look at this 50 cents. This is from Gainesville, Alabama, June 15th, 1865. 50 cents. A 50 cents bill. Look at that. This one right here. Look at that. And there on it is slaves working at the plantation. And that image was on the 50-cent bill of Alabama. Here's another one. They're out here butchering the hog. Where we get chitlins from. And out here butchering the hog with the slave master. Okay? And this one was the $2 bill, the People's Bank of Kentucky, Louisville. Look at that. Right there. So this book, The Confederacy Currency, The Color Money. Folks try to tell you, oh, America doesn't have a racist history. I mean, look at it. Look at the happy slave, folks. See the happy slave right there? The happy slave on the $1 bill of the $50 bill, of the Central Bank of Alabama. Folks, it's important. If you want to have an extensive library, these are the important things that we got to have. Look at that. The Color of Money. I love this book. Let me read from this. Let me share a few things from you. What's important? Why do we tell stories? We tell stories like this because stories become transformative and stories are empowerment. Stories are empowerment. And empowerment brings transformation and awakening. And so that's why it's important that we look at different books. And I'm so grateful for artists. Most of you that are artists, please continue to document what's happening in our world right now so that 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now, other generations will begin to read about what's taking place right now. Just some powerful imagery. And it helps us take a look at the soul of the United States in its history. Okay, part of our history is part of our soul is our memory. And so again, the Confederacy, the Confederate currency, the color of money, and what it does, it goes through all the different currency. Look at this one. The non-taxable certificate. The non-taxable certificate, the Confederate States of America, $500 with a slave on it. This one right here. In this one, it says, the Confederate States of America, 2 years after the ratification of the Treaty of Peace with the United States, $500. And it shows the slave taking a rest on a certificate bill of $500. Here's one for $50. Now here you see the slave masters looking at the slaves in the field, $50. The Bank of the Valley in Virginia. All right, I'll stop on that. Y'all probably like, all right, enough, move on. But again, see, I wanted to share just a few books that I would encourage you to, and I won't review any of the other ones. I'll just bring them up so that you can see. And these are books that I've read, especially when I was in graduate school, when I was studying at South Carolina State University for my degree in English. And people say, well, why do you get an English degree? Well, this is why. Why did you get an English and African-American studies degree? This is why. Why did you take some law school? And why did you start pursuing your doctorate in history and philosophy of education? This is why. And so it exposed me to this type of content and critical thinking that we must be able to engage. Last two books I'll review and then we'll stop. This one is called The Black Image in the White Mind, The Debate on Afro-American Character and Destiny, 1817 to 1914. George M. Fredrickson. This particular book really deals with the illusions of 19th century racism that was largely confined to the South, but also political doctrines that emerged as a result of those particular perspectives. I read this book many, many years ago. All right, Black Image in the White Mind. All right, this particular book is a good one. Foundational, fundamental foundation. And the last one I want to share is a very old book. Woo. And this one was printed in 1972. All right, this book was called In His Image, But. In His Image, But. It's an old book. And Racism and Southern Religion, 1780 to 1910. In His Image, But. That's the name of this book by H. Sheldon Smith. And this one right here talks about the failures of anti-slavery, in defense of bondage, new patterns with old premises, and the triumph of racial orthodoxy. Oh, wow. So many of the things that I've read, and you may wonder, well, how are you informed? This is how. So we're coming up on an hour right now. I just wanted to share a few books with you that I think important to you as a foundation of how we need to build our library, especially in Black history. I have a few more that are here, several of them, but I chose some that I think are important for us as spiritual people, as um, individuals that need to learn history and the importance of documenting our stories. And so, in His image, last one, in the Black image of the white mind. Yeah, these are debatable, and I think it's important that we look at the facts and have these discussions. So, all right, talk to me, folks. What do you think about tonight's podcast? Your thoughts on this content that I shared? If you ever want to have a conversation about history, particularly Black history, some of you may not have known that was my background and some of the study that I did, and why I even went upstairs to my attic and was looking at some of my writings from undergrad and grad school, and I was like, okay, I need to bring some of those out and maybe do a reading concerning some of the essays that I wrote when I was writing for the Carolina Peacemaker back in 1994 and 95, which was one of the first and oldest Black newspapers in Greensboro, North Carolina at that particular time. And that's when I learned how to be an essayist and critique, and was critiqued, and learned how to debate. And it's just a very interesting time. This is before the internet. This is, microfilm, microfiche, interlibrary loans. Didn't have, I think Netscape was just created like in 95. But no, I remember writing my master's thesis on a Brother typewriter. Sure did, with whiteout. So, boy, look how far we've come. So I hope that you've enjoyed the Change Matters podcast this evening. I'm your change architect, Patrick J. Brown. I will let you know the next time we have some of this type of discussion. It's been a while, and because of the bandwidth issues with my time, because I'm starting from a doctorate right now, I haven't been able to really concentrate on building out the podcast content. But please make sure you look for Change Architect or Patrick J. Brown in the YouTube channel. Subscribe to my channel, please. Definitely want you to be a part of the conversations. And thank you so much, everyone, for coming on board. Yes, you're absolutely welcome. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming on. I hope that this conversation and reviewing some of these books, I didn't go into depth, but I just wanted to give some foundation to you that if you don't have these books in your library, perhaps you want to get these, or we can have further dialogue and discussion around this type of content. Because, education is about unlearning at times and relearning. And there are things that we have to dismantle. So I want to thank everybody. I hope that this was just a good dialogue, and perhaps, yes, Tori, absolutely. I hope the recommendations were good. And I encourage some of you to go take a look at these books if you haven't read them. Most of these books, a lot of people don't, or they haven't read them. But I think it's important that we begin to bring back some of this old content and take a look at these leaders. That's why it's important for you to write your book and bring your ideas into the earth. All right. Yes, I'll do that. That is Carmela Head over there. Be Transformed, Transformational Moment. That is her YouTube channel. Check her out. That's my big sis. Big ups to her and everyone else that's on. And I look forward to connecting with you again here on my podcast. And please follow me on YouTube. Yes, you're right. It is about unlearning and relearning. And there are times we just need to be able to have this type of conversation. All right. It's important that we do that, folks, because if we don't, then what ends up happening is we end up believing a lie for so long, and we don't know why we think the way that we think. It helps you because it exposes your constructs. It exposes the constructs that you didn't even know that you had. Even your Christian constructs that may not be healthy. What? Yes, absolutely. There are constructs that we may have that we need to look at and critique. It's not beyond critique. All right? I believe sacred cows make good hamburgers. They do. Sometimes you got to sacrifice a few sacred cows and make some spiritual hamburgers, some ideological hamburgers. Why? Because we need to be able to say, I'm going to eat this one last time and I'm going to dispense of it because I know that it's not helping me. So those of you that are leaders, you're thinkers, If you don't document, it didn't happen. And if you don't document and don't tell your story, somebody else will tell it for you. We have to document your documentaries, you have your films, your poetry, your spoken word, your inventions, documenting your ideas. Go back and look at the old pictures and tell the story of your family. You know, one thing I want to say in closing also, my dad, Dr. Palsy Brown, and I'll post this probably tomorrow, my sister as well will share this, but my father was an allied health professional and director of laboratory services, 26 years, retired Air Force officer, Air Force veteran now. And he was the first African-American president of the American Medical Technologies Organization. That's history in my own family. And there are like thousands upon thousands across the world that are engaged in that organization where they provide certification and training for allied health professionals and medical phlebotomy and laboratory technology. And they certify people. And he was the first African-American president of that organization. Incredible. Their board. And so it's like, wow, my family, I'm able to pass that down on to my children and children, let them know that you can still break seals. You can still be a visionary. You can still be a vanguard. But if you do not document it, it did not happen. Even though it did happen, nobody knows it. Absolutely. Right in my own backyard. And it's in your own backyard, folks. So I want to provide this for you today. Hope that this was a good time for you to connect with me. And I hope that you will come back and connect. If you want to support my podcast, you see the information there on the screen. Please make sure that you go to YouTube channel, subscribe there. I look forward to growing this conversation in the future so we can get the subscriptions up, we can get the recommendations up, and we can have conversations that really matter, that advance us collectively. All right. So again, thank you for coming on today. And this has been good. Yes, you're welcome, Tanya. This has been a necessary conversation for us to have. We need to have these types of conversations. And I hope that I'll see you the next time. All right. Have a good evening. And I will talk with you soon.